everyone, it's Shri, and my topic of discussion is women's status in India and abroad. So, starting with the introduction, what was the position of women in the different stages of ancient India? We'll analyze this and the status of women in the different periods like Rigvedic period, post-Rigvedic period, medieval period, British period, and what was its position after independence. Not only this, we'll cover the aspect and the status of women of overseas, which comparing with the states, countries like Africa, China, Middle East, Scandivia, United States of America, etc. So, my basic overview of this video will say that in the following slides, we'll survey the position of women in India during the different periods, as well as we'll see the status of women in the different countries. So, without any further ado, let's get started. So, if we see like what was the position of women in ancient India, so the position of women in ancient India have been very complicated one because of the paradoxical statements in the different religious scriptures and sometimes in the same text at different places. Now, some have described their status as equal to men, while others have held not only disrespect but even in the positive hatred. This is why it has presented many problems to sociologists while evaluating the women's status in India. The cultural history of India reveals that in India, theoretically, women enjoyed the status of Devi, which is goddess, as described in many religious texts of Hindus, and this was the majority community in India. Though the woman enjoyed the theoretical importance which these texts outline for the wife, who was defined Ardhangni, the better half, but in practice, she had a subservient position than man. She was regarded as a chattel, which means a corporal, which is a movable property with no rights. It was generally seen and believed that women had a lower status with the reference to power and influence than men in all spheres of life, like family, community, religion, and politics. Till recently, it was held that up to marriage, she is protected by her parents during the married life. She is looked after by her husband, and after the death of her husband, she used to spend the remaining years of her life under the roof of her children without any will or desire and the rights in the family. She was not allowed to decide how money would be spent or invested. She didn't even have any money at her disposal. She had to take permission to spend money from elders like father, brother, or husband, or any other male or female elder person in the family. In brief, she had no personality of her own. Some scholars have explained this inferior status of women as a result of patriarchal code of living. The rigid codes of behavior as outlined for women in Brahminical texts were also responsible for the low status of women in India. In the following slides, we'll survey in brief the position of women in India from the Rigvedic period to the modern times. Now, coming to the next slide, which says the position of women in the Rigvedic period. Now, in Vedic times, women were not treated as inferior or subordinated, but to equal to men in all the matters of life. Let's see. It is generally upheld on the basis of the instances depicted in the religious text, like example Vedas, Upanishad, Smritis, epics like Ramayana and Mahabharata, and other Dharma Shastras, that in the ancient India, especially in the Rigvedic period, women enjoyed equal status with the men. They had an honorable place in the society. They were not scheduled uh, from men and freely participated in the public life. They attended great assemblies and state occasions. They studied Vedas and composed hymns. They also distinguished themselves in science and learning at their times. They were considered intellectual companies of their husband, as the friend and loving helpers in the journey of life of their partners, in the religious duties, and the center of domestic bliss. In Vedic times, women were not treated as inferior or the subordinate, but equal to men in all the matters of life. They were given education and had a voice in the selection of their husband. Marriage was regarded as a religious bond. Child marriage was unknown. Often, there were love marriage were known as Gandharva Vivaha. Like if you talk about Gandharva Vivaha, in the form of Gandharva Vivaha, the mutual consent of the girl and the boy is the only precondition for the marriage. There is no intervention from their parents or the kinsmen of the bride or groom in arranging the marriage. It was a sanctioned form of marriage in the exceptional circumstances and among certain classes. Monogamy was a general rule and polygamy was almost not known, right? Women enjoyed the complete freedom in the household matters and in the religious field. Women enjoyed all the rights and regularly participated in the religious ceremonies as well. In fact, the performance of the religious ceremonies was considered invalid without the wife joining her husband, as she was regarded as Ardhangni, which means the better half. That means the women were not inferior but equal to men because they were regarded as Ardhangni, which is known as better half. Now, the references in the Rig Vedas to the life of a widow are very few, but it was not characterized by the restrictions and atrocities as in the post Vedic days. Remarriages of widows were allowed at that time. There are number of references to the custom of Niyogya, where a brother of deceased husband or any other person could marry the widow. The earlier Dharma Shastras writers allowed divorce as well. Like Kautilya gave detailed rule of divorce. As regard as sati, the burning of widows, Sakuntala Rao Shastri writes that Rigveda does not mention anywhere the practice of burning or burial of widows with their dead husband. As regard to the property rights, according to the Vedic hymens, both husband and wife was joint owner of the property. Women inherited and possessed the property, but their rights were limited, but there was some rights they have. As a daughter, she had no share in the father's property. Similarly, as a wife, a woman had no direct share in the husband properties. If we talk about widows, so as a widow, she was supposed to lead an ascetic life and had no share in the husband's property. Thus, it may conclude that Vedic period women had equal rights with men. Their status was fairly high, and they were treated as equal with the men, almost in the all spheres of life. Right now, coming to the post-Vedic period, which in which the position of enjoyed by the women in the Vedic period deteriorated in the post-Vedic period. It was gradually degraded in the Puranic and the Smriti periods. Now, the description of the position before 300 BC shows that she enjoyed a fairly high status, though not to the extent that she enjoyed in the Vedic period. It appears that several drastic changes that took place in the Indian society about 300 BC to the beginning of the Christian era led to the curtailment of the freedom of women, imposition of Brahminical rules and the code of conduct, rigid restrictions imposed by the caste system and the joint family system were the main reason for lowering the status of women in this period. A daughter began a daughter began to be regarded as a curse. They were denied the right of inheritance and the ownership of the property. Pre-puberty marriages came to the practice. She was forbidden to offer sacrifices and prayers and undertake pilgrimages. Practice of polygamy came to be tolerated during this period. Now, some of the Dharma Shastras mention about the prohibition of Niyogya and the widow marriage. Now, the widow was asked to devote herself to an aesthetic life at home, marriages were became irrevocable union as far as the wife was concerned. The Smriti writers preached that the wife should look upon her husband as a god. Like widows were required to spend a life of penitence and austerity. Sati had become popular by the 7th century AD. In this period, women were regarded just as a means of satisfying the physical desires of men. Just to refer one instance of Mahabharata, it is said that there was no creature more sinful than man. Woman is the root of all ills. This simple quotation is sufficient to prove that how disrespect was shown towards women. However, it is not out of place to mention here that Indian scriptures are full of paradoxical statements. At one place, woman is regarded as the goddess, held high esteemed, where at the other place, in the same scripture, in some other context, they regarded no better than just slaves or chattels, right? Chattels, I have already mentioned before that, which is a corporal movable property with no rights. Now, disregarding that, what was the practiced at particular time? The ancient Indian scriptures and documents like Mahabharata, Ramayana, Vedic hymns, and various codes of law of Manu give women a very high and protected place in their basic moral codes. Husband and wife stood as equal before God. Up to this period of Parda, which is veil, was not commonly observed by women. Divorce was, however, not permissible to them. But then it was not permissible to men either. Their position was not one of the complete disability, but one dictated by justice and fairness. Women used to help their male members of the family in the economic pursuits. They sometimes accompanied their husband or the other members of the family in hunting and agriculture pursuits. Now, coming to the medieval period, so the period between 11th century to 18th century, it was witnessed further deterioration in the position of women due to the impact of the Muslim culture. In this period, female infanticide, child marriage, further system, sati, and slavery were the main social evils affecting the position of women. The birth of a female child began to be regarded as curse, a bad luck. They were almost confined to the doors of their homes. There was further curtailment of the freedom of women in the matters of education, maid selection, public appearances, etc. Further system came to be rigorously followed. Women education was almost banned. More and more feeling of conservatism increase about women. She not only continued to hold the low status in and outside home, rather, her position worsened in this period. It is often said that in India, the Parda, which is veil system, came into existence only after the arrival of Mughals. A.S. Atlekar, in his book, The Position of Women in Hindu Civilization, in 1962, I guess, writes that this is nearly 2000 years from BC 20 to 1800 AD. The position of women steadily deteriorated, though she was fondled by the parents, loved by the husband, and revered by the children. The revival of sati, prohibition of remarriage, the spread of pradha, and the greater prevalence of polygamy made her position very bad. Thus, there was a vast difference between the status of women in the early Vedic periods and the subsequent periods, stretching from the post-Vedic period to the medieval period. The dual standards of morality set by the Manu Smriti and the other Smritis continue to prevail right up to now, though some changes are visible in the urban educated women. Now, coming to the British period, so during the British rule of about 200 years, early 18th century to the first half of the 20th century, some substantial progress was achieved in eliminating the inequalities between men and women in the matters of education, employment, social and property rights, and so forth. Sati Prada, in female infanticide, child marriage, inheritance, slavery, prohibition of widow remarriage, and the lack of women's right in the different fields were some of the problems which attracted the attention of British Raj. Now, though the British rulers initially decided not to interfere with the traditional social fabric of Indian people, which is the majority was Hindus, and such, they took no steps to bring any changes in the status of women in India. It is only in the later half of the 19th century and the first quarter of 20th century that they took some steps to abolish or change some social custom, though legislative measures. For such measures, incentive was provided to them by some social reforms such as Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, Dayanand Saraswati, Keshav Chandra Sen, Swami Vivekananda, Maharishi Karve, Justice Rande, Mahatma Gandhi, and others. Though through the efforts and the various movements launched by these great social leaders of the 19th century before independence, it had been possibly to get many legislation passed and public opinion mobilized in the favor of some issues of social reforms. These steps have paved the way in removing the obstacles in the process of women. Not only this, it had helped in eliminating inequalities between men and women and giving proper respect to the other half of the society. The most significant legislation relating to the problems faced by the Indian Hindu women passed during the British periods were as follows, like abolition of Sati Act, which is passed in 1813, the Hindu Widow Remarriage Act, which was passed in 1856, Civil Marriage Act, which was passed in 1872, Married Women's Property Act, which was passed in 1874, the Child Marriage Restraint Act 1929, Hindu Law of Inheritance 1929, the Hindu Women's Right to Property Act 1939, Hindu Marriage Disability Removal Act 1946. Besides these acts, many provincial governments also enacted some legislation in 1779, which was infanticide was declared to be murder by the Bengal Regulation 21 in 1804. This was extended to other parts of the country as well. Other significant features of 19th century was the attempt made by the social reformers to educate Indian girls. For more than 200,000 years, from about BC 300, there was practically no formal education for women. Only few women of the upper caste and the classes were given some education at home. The ideas of imparting education in the formal manner first emerged during the British period, Christian missionaries took great interest to impart education to the girls. It was in 1824 when the first girls' school was started in Bombay, now Mumbai. In 1882, the girls were allowed to pursue their higher education. Since then, to pursue their has been continuous progress in the field of education of girls in India. In the last decades of 19th century, a marked change took place in the outlook of both men and women about the education and the employment of the woman as a teacher, nurse, doctors, etc. This change took outlook towards women's education also helped in raising the age of marriage and enacting legislation to ban sati. Thus, the ground prepared by the 19th century social reformers and their untiring efforts led to the emancipation of women. This also helped them to take their rightful place in the society. Now, analyzing the status of women after independence. In addition to the measures to uplift the status of women in India initiated by the Britishers, many vigorous steps like legal, social, economic, and political have been taken by the government of India. After independence, by removing the hurdles put in their way, By traditional past, the efforts of the social reformers and their movements launched in the pre-independence period also bore fruits. The Indian national movements also led to emancipation of Indian women. The leaders of national movement realized that the liberation of the country from the bondage of imperialization was impossible without the active participation of women who constituted half of the population of the country. Most of the social reformers and thinkers of the 19th and 20th centuries were influenced by the tenets of the liberal philosophy of the West, which emphasized the principle of the contract rather than the status, a rational outlook of life and problems, freedom of speech, criticism of authority, questioning or accepted dogmas, and finally, the recognition of the value of the individual and insistence on the rights of man as opposed to his duties. They also got impetus from the Upanishads and other Hindu scriptures. The decades after the independence have seen tremendous change in the status and the position of women in the Indian society. The constitution had laid down as a fundamental right the equality of sexes. But the change from a position to utter degradation of women to a position of equality is not a simple case of progress of women in the modern era. To uplift the status of women, many legislation pertaining to women were enacted after independence. These were mainly related to the marriage, divorce, inheritance, property, and employment. Some important acts are mentioned below. You can see on the slide as well. Like the Hindu Marriage Validity Act, the Special Marriage Act, the Hindu Marriage Act 1955, the Hindu Succession Act 1956, Immoral Trafficking Act 1956, the Sati Prevention Act 1987, the Dowry Prohibition Act 1961, the Indecent Representation of Women Prohibition Act 1986, Prohibition of Child Marriage Act, Protection of Women and Domestic Violence, Compulsory Registration of Marriage. Besides these acts, specially related to the employments are the Factory Act, Employments Insurance Act 1948, Maternity Benefit Act, the Equal Remuneration. The above legislations and many other emancipatory actions to social reformers have no doubt raised the status of women in India, but still is much is to be done in this field. The institution of bigamy, man marrying many number of women, has almost come to an end. If detected, it has become a punishable offense. Today, both sexes have the right of a civil marriage. The age of marriage without parents' consent has been increased to the 21 for boys and 18 for girls. Thus, the monogamy, along with the facility of judicial separation, nullity, and divorce, even on a mutual consent, inheritance, equal share in the parental property, adoption, widow remarriage, and the sati abolition, are some of the salient features of the post-independence era, which put men and women on the equal footing from the point of the view of legislative measures. However, the social legislations have not been effective in India because of many reasons. One of the important reason is the most of the women are not fully aware of the measures adopted by the state for their upliftment, and even if unaware, they do not use them because of the old social values that are still persisting. These traditions and values inhibited them to take any revolutionary steps. Legal or legislative sanctions alone cannot bring any substantial change in the downtrodden position of women unless there is a marked change in the attitude and the consciousness of men and women both. In this regard, their illiteracy is the one of the great hindrance. Like according to the census of 2001, 45.84%, and according to the census of 2011, 34% of the women are still illiterate in India. Even literate women also do not exercise their right to equality wherever it is required. Thus, the status of women has been raised in the eyes of law, but they are still far from equal to men in various spheres of life. In practice, they continue to suffer discrimination, harassment, humiliation, and exploitation in in and outside home. Theoretically, women might have given more freedom, but in practice, they still suffer many hardship, inhuman dignities, and unworthy treatment everywhere. Within the home, she is still not treated as per with male counterpart. Bearing a few urban educated families, a baby girl is never welcomed with much as neglect and happiness as a baby boy. Sometimes the birth of a girl regarded as a bad omen. They are not treated as equal to men and not given due respect in the family. 75% of women are in the labor force, but only 0.1% has property rights. Male roles as father and husband still dominate both over both his children and wife. The power to govern the home and the authority still rest in the hands of male head of the household. The dominant father model still persists the most of the middle and the lower class family, leaving aside a few, and in the so-called modern family wives have not become equal partners to their husband, even if they are well educated or more educated to their husbands. Most of the decisions of the household, from purchasing daily household items to decide about the education and the marriage of their children, are taken by the fathers or husbands. There is no significant change in the attitude of males, even in the families where the females are working outside at home. Women, as daughters or wives, have to seek permission of their father's husband for going outside home or for receiving the higher education. In some families, it is seen that the husband do not allow their wives for the same caliber and the education to take up any job assignment of the same status outside the home. They prefer their educated wives should utilize their energies just in home management and rearing and caring of children or old parents. Women lowers the status in India's society, contributes to early marriages, lower literacy, poor nutrition, and the high fertility and mobility levels, especially during the reproductive age. In professional fields, their condition is also not better. Till recently, women from the higher caste were not allowed to work outside of the home. Some remunerative jobs, they do not enjoy equal rights in the matters on the occupational fields. They do not hold offices of the high rank, leaving aside the popular cases. A woman executive may be of a same rank as a male executive, but because she is a woman, she may not receive the same honor and prestigious he receives. The case of Super Cop Kiran Bedi, well known, she was suspended for the post of Delhi Police Commissioner by a man 2 years junior to her in service. Similarly, a woman IS officer, Reva, did not make it cabinet secretary, and a Veena Sikri, IFS, was not appointed as a foreign secretary. There are many numbers of other victims who wither unseen. 21 years ago, Wall Street Journal had coined the term glass ceiling to refer to the apparent barriers that prevent from reaching the top of hierarchy that still holds true barring few exceptional cases. Furthermore, women earn less than men, have less access to more prestigious, better paying occupations, even when they are equal in all aspects. The best example is provided by the ruler India, where in theory women are equated with the goddess, but in actual practice they are treated as dirges. The problem of inferiority, inequality, dependence, and the exploitation experienced by the women have not much changed in the villages where most of the India lives even after 65 years of the independence. Ill treatment is occupied with no equal opportunity for social participation in spite of the immense amount of the work which is expected of them in the home as well as in the agriculture field or in some employment. One of the main characteristics of women in her tasking dexterity is usually the one of who handles home as well as occupational field or the office. To conclude, Let us quote Jesse Bernard, who argued that the status of women cannot compare with that of man. It is generally said that men have the higher status because they are usually better educated and have more organizational skills and experience than women. In addition to these, women acquire their status from their husbands and that they are socialized to think themselves as inferior, and they are psychosociological conditioned to use the modern term. They are programmed to be wives and mothers, non-competitive with the men because they are less able to compete. Furthermore, women earn less than men, have less access to more prestigious and better paying occupations, even when they are equally qualified or experienced. Even having children increase the husband powers for the wife become more dependent. Now, moving to the status of women abroad. Like, what is the status in Africa? So, culture in Africa has is very harsh on women. They are subjected to atrocities from the domestic violence to genital mutilation. This has become a growing concern across the globe. Seems like African women bear the greatest burden of ill health and disease. Women in Africa constitute 60% of HIV/AIDS in Africa. Polygamy to force sex and are not only a violation of women's basic human rights, but also a heavy burden of their health status and their chances in the labor market. But things seems to be improving for women in the most African nations thanks to the efforts of many organizations for the betterment and the upliftment of the women across the globe, including WHO. Now, if we just see the status of women in China, then the government of Republic of China has actively promoted the cultural, social, economic, and the political roles of women. China, in general, is a male-dominated society, but the People Republic has vowed to bring equality between the men and women. There has been a rise in women employment, admission of women into the higher education institution, but there are still signs of a lower status of women, and reports of the infanticides and one child policy prove this. Although traditional marriages like arranged marriages is still the way, even today, women role varies slightly depending on their social status. The Marriage Act of 1950 gave women the right to make their own marital decisions. So there seems to change education, employment, and the healthcare rights are equal in the today's People Republic of China. However, participation in the politics and the government is almost nil, probably due to the male dominance. Globalization has had a positive impact on China, no doubt, but also has a negative impacts like prostitution and human trafficking. Now, if you see the status of women in the Middle East has been in transition since the early parts of the 20th century. The social laws of Islamic women widely different than other laws for women in other cultures. There have been several feminist movements in the some Muslim nations, but mostly they do not get the political support for the social equality and are snubbed away. But women in general have legal and economic equality with men in political life, access to education, professional opportunities, and salaries, goals for which Western women have long had to struggle. But the child marriages, submissions, and the obedience to man, social rejection in case of divorce, and polygamy are still norm in the most Muslim countries. The most conservative obsession, according to the Western feminist, is the veil, but the Muslim women do not agree that they feel it is their choice of symbol of their religion. A lot of Muslim women are happy just the way they are. They feel they do not need rescuing from the West. So this debate is relative. Saudi Arabia is an example of Islamic state which resists the modernization of women and legal status of women in the Middle East. Right of Muslim women remain a widely contested issue. If you talk about Denmark and Sweden are far by the most liberal countries for the women in this world, they have highest standards for living women and enjoyed the greatest freedom of speech and opportunities. Due to sexual freedom and access to free birth control, abortion, and open society, there are fewer unplanned pregnancies and STDs, which helps in maintaining the overall health in Sweden, Denmark, and Norway. Women have legal, civil, political, economic, financial, and social liberties and equalities. Now, coming to the status of women in America, according to the recent article in the Washington Post, quoted, for a woman in America, equality is still illusion, unquoted. No doubt, we live in the greatest country in the world and are unfamiliar with these ways and atrocities against the women in other countries. We are still under the illusion that men and women are equal in the USA. This is the home of women superpowers like Oprah Winfrey, Hillary Clinton, and Supreme Court women judges Ginsburg, Sotomayor. Yet we are far cry from sexism. Women hold 17% of the seat in the Congress. Abortion is legal. 85% women of the work are outside the home. 70% have no male provider and not sure if the feminism or a cry or help. Now, concluding the topic with the some surveys, like according to the survey of the Natwest International Personal Banking, 83% of the women who work abroad believe the experience will stand them in good stead for moving up the career ladder. Having spent some time working overseas and generally considered to demonstrate the future of employees, a number of important skills such as readiness to accept new challenges while also allowing individual to take advantages of a career advancing opportunity which might not have been available in the home countries. Out of over 400 women interviewed by the Netwest, over half, like 52%, said that the experience of working overseas had exceeded their expectations. Many participants admitted, however, that despite improved careers prospects, working abroad could be difficult. Two-thirds have said that they did not feel they were treated as quoted in equal in status and quoted to the male counterparts, with around a quarter complaining of a male stereotyping, like 25%, and of feeling left out from the informal communication between the colleagues, which are 21% of nearly a fifth, also agreed that they found the lack of influential mentors in the new home hard. The countries where women felt there was the most gender patriarchy was Canada, followed by the New Zealand, USA, and Australia. The place that came out worse out of the 12 locations featured in this survey was UAE. Now, in the previous slides, we have covered the position of women in India from Rigvedic period to modern times, as well as we have seen the status of women in the different countries of all over the world, and we have also seen the NatWest survey. Now, what do you think? Does India actually stands when it comes to the rights of women? And please let us know your opinion about the status of women in India and abroad. Now, ending my video on the quotation given by the Swami Vivekananda, who is a Hindu monk, says that the best thermometer to the progress of a nation is its treatment of its women. There is no chance for the welfare of the world unless the condition of women is improved. That's it for this topic. If you have any questions, feel free to type us in the comment section. And thank you for your time and consideration.